We would like to take you back to a time when horses were considered part of Hungary's national treasure. Let me introduce László Monostory, a retired chemist, son of László Monostory, about whom we are about to hear. Les is famous in his own right as a conservationist, founder of the Central New York chapter of the Isaac Walton League of America, and was responsible for the reclaiming of Onondaga Lake through the cleanup of the Bear Trap Creek, for which he received several commendations and citations. Laci, could you tell us just a little bit about your father?
Well, thank you, Kuni. I guess I would like to start with my father's obituary because it's just a quick introduction of his history. He passed away in February 2005, was born in October 1909. And I'm reading from the Seattle Times obituary. László was born in Hungary and received diplomas as agronomist specializing in animal husbandry, and was writing his doctoral thesis on horse breeding science when World War II broke out. His knowledge of pedigrees was phenomenal. He helped arrange the evacuation of hundreds of horses from Hungarian state stud farms to Germany. He and his family fled to Germany in March 1945, accompanied by a herd of 80 horses, water buffalo, sheep, and cows through the perilous Hollandtal Pass. In 1951, the family arrived in Cleveland, Ohio, and later moved to Bellevue, Washington in 1964.
I understand that when the Russians started to advance into Hungary, they had already destroyed, probably eaten, the stud horses on the Hortobágy, and General Petko Satner was László's commanding officer, and he is the one that decided to ask your father to take the mares and the stud farm, as you had mentioned, the 80 horses, to Germany. But what is not apparent is that the general took 280 horses already, and your father was sort of a backup just in case the horses on the train got bombed. So that's why your father went on foot. Do you think you could just tell us a little about the journey that your father took?
Actually, General Santner made arrangements as the Russians were, well, even before the Russians were close to Budapest, to transport not just 380, 1,200 of Hungary's horses from various stud farms. And these were sent by train to Bergstetten, Germany. And fortunately, the entire shipment arrived in Germany, the trains were not bombed, so all of those horses survived. But he did tell my father to keep the horses at Kisbér and leave Hungary, when the Russians basically came closer, in case the horses were bombed, and at least some of the Hungarian stud farm residents would still be transferred then through Austria by my father.
Perhaps you could go into detail about what and whom this caravan of horses led by your father included, and the route they took, and what perils he encountered on the journey, because you were 3, I believe, at that time,
right,
and don't remember much. probably nothing, but still, you sort of know the family history.
Sure. No, I don't remember Hungary at all. The only memory I have of Hungary is being taken underground during a bomb raid. That's my only memory at all of Hungary. And even the escape across Austria, which was a month-long excursion and took practically a month. I don't remember any of that. My earliest memory is of Arnsdorf, Germany, where we arrived with the horses. When my father was commander of the stud farm in Alsóbrück, which was in Transylvania, he had 30 covered wagons prepared for the trip from Alsóbrück to Babona. And so, the Russian forces were advancing at the time, and basically father made sure that all of the Hungarian Ménes that was at Alsóbrück would be taken to Kisbér, and that was several hundred horses that were done at the time. And of course the Russians were continuing their advance. The trip across Austria covered more than 300 miles, traveling through mountain passes, and we traveled mostly at night. And the reason was because there were American, British, and even Russian fighter planes that were strafing the highways across Austria. So this made the trip that much more difficult. Actually, I believe my father had about 130 horses, as well as some livestock that he transported across the Alps. He did have about 80 soldiers, many of them married with families that traveled on these 30 covered wagons, pulled by horses, of course. And they had some pretty nervous adventures meeting with various German SS divisions on their way across Austria. I'm trying to remember some of the stories that my dad told me. Well, one was that I remember is they stopped to rest on an early spring day. We're talking about March through April that this excursion took place. And somehow my father just wasn't at ease. He felt a push that they needed to travel on. So the entire caravan and horses went on into some woods that were nearby, and just as the final wagon entered the woods, fighter planes came strafing that entire section of road. So that's one of the stories that I recall. Another story happened just before they reached the Hollental, which was the Valley of Hell. And there, a German sergeant, I believe, told my father that no, he wouldn't allow them to proceed past there. And they actually had their weapons pointed at my father. Now, my father spoke German very well, and the soldiers could tell that this was a pretty critical situation here. My soldiers were not carrying their weapons, but the weapons were stored in the wagons, and they knew where those weapons were. So all of a sudden the soldiers, his Hungarian soldiers, grabbed those weapons, pointed them at the Germans. They outnumbered the Germans, and the Germans finally allowed them to pass via this Hollenthal Pass, which was an extremely steep and difficult pass to go through. And my father mentioned at the time that he led the first wagon with his family down an incredibly steep slope to enter this valley and to make that particular crossing. Another time, they just avoided a portion of the Russian troops that were entering Austria. And they were traveling at night, and there was a German tank battalion ahead of them. And the Germans allowed Dad and his caravan to pass, but they got sort of impatient as the last wagons went by and the horses traveled by. And this was at night. And they started their tanks and scared the remaining horses that had not yet passed by the tank battalion. And my father lost 40 of his, I believe it was close to 130 horses that they had. 40 of those horses basically were scared and died. They fell off the hillside to their deaths. What happened is that somehow my dad met up with General Sontner, his commander in Hungary, around the same time that the U.S. Third Army commander George Patton came by for a visit. And so General Sontner had made the arrangements for a parade before General Patton. And this is how my father actually got to meet General Patton as well. And this was sometime in 1946. Now, General Patton was not a friend of the Russians. And unfortunately, at that time, politics got in the way because, you know, the Yalta Conference was being planned, and the Americans wanted to, well, they had to work out some sort of an arrangement in terms of what troops were going to occupy different parts of Europe at the time: Germany, Austria, Hungary, Poland, etc. And because of General Patton's concern and dislike of the Russians, he was removed of his command. And sadly, I think it was towards the end of 1946 that he was in an accident in France and died in a car accident. His position was taken over by General Owens. By order of this Major Owens, most of my dad's rescued 100 some horses were sent to the German Serum Institute in Bering-Berke. After the war, there was a tremendous need for medicines and serum, and sadly, many of not just my father's horses, but also some of the Hungarian horses from Bergstetten ended up at this Serum Institute. Some other horses were also auctioned off through this Colonel Owens, and over 100 horses were eventually sent by ship to West Virginia and auctioned off. This was in early 1946, and 23 stallions, 82 mares were obtained from Hungary's Kisber and Babona bred horses. Actually, Life magazine published pictures of these horses when they arrived in West Virginia under the title of Nazi Horses Being Auctioned Off. And this was in the May 1946 issue of Life magazine.
And I believe your father recognized some of these horses.
He did, as a matter of fact. His knowledge of horses was incredible. As a young child, he lived on a farm where horses were, kept, and he had a particular special gift in memorizing the breeding history of the horses initially in his community in Borogna, and later all his life he had this special talent for remembering the breeding history of the horses at Babona, Kisbér, Alsózsuk, the 3 stud farms where he spent most of his career in Hungary.
I think we should also mention the fact of why the Americans were so interested in these horses. They had the Army remount program where the horse quality was very poor, and they were hoping to regenerate that quality through these mares.
Well, this is the case with horse breeding in general, is that as the Hungarians did originally at Babona and the other stud farms in Hungary, is they were trying to breed, the best horses that they could for whatever use was needed at the time. Going back in Hungarian history, the Hussars were very well known for the quality of their steeds, going back to the 17 and 1800s. And, that same level of looking for quality horses was true throughout Europe and even in America when horses were still, fairly much in use following the Second World War, although, more and more the United States was getting mechanized. So this influx of, finely bred horses from Hungary was valued here in the United States as well.
I was wondering if you could just mention a couple of sentences about your father was invited after the family came to Cleveland. He worked in a factory.
Right.
And then he was discovered by a horse breeder from the West Coast.
Right.
And could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, my father started work in 1951 at the Cleveland Twist Drill Company as a drill inspector. And so he was a factory worker for about 13 years in Cleveland, but he always, by mail and other means, kept in touch with the horse breeding community, both in Europe, with his former commander, who at the time took over as director of a state stud farm in Egypt, and this was General Petko Suntner. In 1963, a Kemper Freeman in Bellevue, Washington, was looking for starting a horse breeding operation. He had purchased Huflinger horses from Austria, and he was looking for someone to breed those horses and also train them on how to handle carriage-led wagons. And the Hungarians were famous, especially General Petko Santner, was particularly famous for his what they call 3-in-hand, 4-in-hand, 5-in-hand carriages, which were actually competitive competitions that took place across Europe. And that's partly how General Santner became famous for his horse breeding skills. So anyhow, 50 people applied for this job. And out of those 50, my dad eventually was selected to take over as the resident director of the horse operations. This Kemper Freeman was an interesting person. He was a veterinarian who developed a new technique for breeding chickens. And he purchased a large farm in Woodinville, which is a rural community not too far from Bellevue. Bellevue was on the far side of Lake Washington from Seattle, Washington. And so on this farm, he had racist chickens. He also had several large stables on that farm. And I don't know how many acres of fenced, pasture land on which these horses were kept. So that's the operation that my dad took over. And so he worked about 4 or 5 years for this Kemper Freeman, and then later moved to Bellevue. And in Bellevue, they lived in a place that had what they called a Bridle Trails State Park. And this was no more than a quarter mile from our house where we lived in Bellevue. This was in a rural part. Bellevue eventually became a city, quite large in population. It started out as a village. I've seen maps of the east shore of Lake Washington, where it was a tiny village. By the time my dad was there, it was a fairly good-sized community of at least 100,000 or more. Who else? Microsoft was started up in the Bellevue area, and actually the Microsoft main complex was only 2 or 3 miles away from where my parents lived at the time. But a lot of people kept horses in that area, and my dad became like the horse, babysitter for all of the neighbors.
How about horse whisperer?
Horse whisperer, okay.
A real remarkable thing happened in 1992, which I think is just sort of the icing on the cake, if you would. Mm-hmm. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. The Babon Ménes in Hungary, over 200 years ago, bred a special breed of Arabian horses called Shagya Arabians. It was named after a Arabian stallion that was imported from Egypt. And somehow this stallion bred a line of horses that had very good genetics that the Hungarians bred at Babona for well over 200 years. So my dad, after he moved to Bellevue, became knowledgeable with the American Shagya Association. There was a North American Shagya Association started in the 1950s by a Countess Bechenier who lived in Montana. Then there were additional Shagya Arabians in Nebraska and New York State. So by the 1980s, my dad got to know many of these Shagya horse breeders in the United States. He also kept in touch with Shagya horse breeders in Europe. because there was also a international Shagia Arabian Association. In 1992, my dad was invited to Babolna for a meeting of this international Shagia Arabian organization. The Hungarian Ministry of Agriculture invited my dad for a celebration and a bust of General Petko Santner, which was made and presented at this international event in 1992.
I was just wondering about your experiences in 1992, because we have a different concept of what our parents are like, and you experienced other people sort of approaching your father and perhaps celebrating him. And could you just tell us a little bit about that experience?
So this opportunity to travel to the Babolna and Kishber stud farms was quite an opportunity. Of course, it was a great opportunity for my father. And my father was very much appreciated by the Hungarian Shagia Association, particularly in Kishber, where he was a commanding officer just before the end of the war. So we took a trip to Kishber, and the old stable was still there. The offices where my father used to live was converted into a hospital. And so I took pictures of my father, the Hungarian Shagia Association members, and somebody took a picture of me as well. I was standing on a grate, I guess, up on a second floor of the hospital in Kishber. And at Babolna, we were shown all of the different horse stables. The history was written up in various plates, and we got to see, the buildings dated back to the 1780s. And then, of course, my father met with these famous breeders from various parts of Europe, and my father, spoke German very well, which was either German or English, were the two most common languages at the time. And so this was quite an experience, both for my father and for myself. And I took advantage of the opportunity to take well over 100 photos and slides.
Yeah.